Anne had some eyebrow-raising thoughts about Camilla. Keep watching to find out her true feelings. The tragic death of Queen Elizabeth II on September 8th precipitated an outpouring of grief and mourning, not only from her subjects in the United Kingdom, but from citizens around the world. Indeed, her funeral ended up becoming one of the most viewed broadcasts in the country's history.
Under the quiet glow of a Sandringham lamp, Princess Anne uncovered something she never expected. Letters that exposed a truth buried deep inside royal walls. Camilla's handwriting, carefully chosen words, and a strategy that revealed far more than affection. It revealed control. As Anne read each page, the weight of betrayal crushed her chest. These weren't just personal exchanges. They were evidence of years-long manipulation that shaped Charles, silenced Diana, and rewrote the very heartbeat of the monarchy. With her hands trembling and tears falling, Anne didn't just read history. She became part of a truth too powerful to ignore. The late-night discovery. Anne finds the letters. It was past midnight at Sandringham. The grand estate, often filled with formal receptions and royal chatter, was unusually quiet. Only the low hum of a distant clock echoed through the hallways. In a seldom-used wing, Princess Anne moved alone, searching for a misplaced book. What she found instead would shake her to the core. As she stepped into a modest, oak-paneled sitting room, she noticed a cluttered desk. Odd for such a meticulous space. Papers lay scattered, as if someone had searched through them in haste, or hidden something important. On instinct, Anne reached for a pile in the corner. Beneath a leather notebook were several aged envelopes, cream-colored, sealed. Her breath caught the moment she saw the handwriting on the front. It was Camilla's. Curious and increasingly uneasy, she opened one. The ink was slightly faded, but the tone was unmistakably sharp. The opening line sent a chill down her spine. If Charles is to step into the light, Diana must remain in shadow. Anne froze. Her pulse raced. This wasn't a personal letter. It was a plan, a script, a strategy written by the now Queen Consort, long before titles were ever official. Her hands trembled as she read on. Every word felt like betrayal disguised as support. She sat down, unable to keep standing under the weight of what she was reading. These weren't just private thoughts. They were pointed suggestions, precise guidance, even manipulation, crafted for Charles during some of the most emotionally vulnerable periods of his life. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Sandringham was silent, but Anne's heart thundered in her chest. What was she holding? A confession? A conspiracy? Or the missing link to decades of confusion and heartbreak? She carefully laid out each envelope, skimming dates and contents. Some were from the early 90s, others shockingly postmarked just months after Princess Diana's death. The realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't accidental. Camilla had shaped Charles's views, guided his decisions, and perhaps even rewritten how history would remember Diana. As Anne closed the final envelope, tears welled in her eyes. She had always been protective of her family, fiercely loyal, quietly brave, but now she felt like she had uncovered a truth that could shatter everything. These letters weren't just words on paper. They were a window into a hidden chapter of royal life, a chapter written in private, but meant to influence the world. And in that room, with the past laid bare in ink and parchment, Anne was no longer just a princess. She was a sister, a daughter, and a woman caught between silence and justice. The air in the room had shifted. Nothing would be the same again. Revealed Camilla's secret influence. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the room, But it didn't warm Princess Anne. She sat at the same desk, surrounded by the letters she'd uncovered just hours earlier. Her eyes were tired but wide open. Sleep had been impossible. What she read the night before kept looping in her mind like a broken reel. She now knew too much, and yet not enough. Anne began rereading one letter in particular. Dated 1997, mere months after Diana's tragic death, it contained what looked like strategy rather than sympathy. Camilla's words were sharp and persuasive, carefully crafted not to console Charles, but to guide him. The phrase, "It's time to step out from Diana's shadow," reappeared. It hadn't been just a suggestion, it had been a mission. The tone of the letter was urgent and unapologetic. Camilla wrote about shaping the royal image, pushing back against the Diana narrative, and urging Charles to take stronger public positions. She referenced advisors, media contacts, and even hinted at shifts in palace protocol. Her influence didn't stop at Charles's emotions. It bled into the structure of the monarchy itself. Anne's jaw tightened. There was one particular sentence that made her pause. "You've been the prince long enough. It's time they see you as the king-in-waiting, not the widower of a saint." The word saint had been underlined, mocked. Diana's memory, casually dismissed like it was in the way. Anne's hands trembled. The cruelty wasn't overt. It was subtle, strategic, and cutting. She imagined Charles, grieving, vulnerable. Would he have followed Camilla's direction because he believed in it, or because he needed to believe in someone? Anne knew her brother. He could be swayed when he was uncertain. And Camilla. Camilla had always known how to speak to those insecurities. The more she read, the clearer it became. Camilla hadn't just been a confidant. She had positioned herself as a shaper of legacy, nudging Charles to reclaim control of a narrative that Diana had owned in the public's heart. Anne looked out the window, fists clenched. This wasn't just palace gossip. These letters were proof of manipulation, of quiet ambition, and of a calculated effort to reshape royal history. And now Anne had to decide what to do with them. Flashback, Balmoral whispering. The memory came rushing back with brutal clarity. Anne was back at Balmoral years ago, late summer. Diana was gone. The family was still reeling. Grief had settled over the estate like fog. But there had been one night, quiet, almost forgettable, when she had seen Camilla and Charles speaking alone. They stood by the fireplace, low voices blending with the crackle of burning logs. Anne hadn't heard much, but one sentence floated out, clear and unmistakable. "It's time to step out from Diana's shadow." At the time, Anne had assumed Camilla meant well. Perhaps she was trying to help Charles move on. But now, after reading those letters, the moment looked entirely different. It was no longer a gentle push toward healing. It was an early move in a long game of influence. Camilla had leaned in close. Her hand rested on Charles's wrist, her voice a blend of confidence and quiet urgency. Charles hadn't argued. He had simply nodded, distant, lost in thought. Anne had watched from the shadows, unseen. She had dismissed it then, not wanting to believe it meant more. But now she saw it for what it was. That moment was the spark. The beginning of a campaign that would slowly pull Charles away from Diana's legacy and toward Camilla's vision for the future. And Anne hadn't stopped it. She hadn't even questioned it. The past and present collided in Anne's heart. That whisper in Balmoral wasn't just a passing comment. It was a quiet declaration of war. On memory, on mourning, on everything Diana had stood for. And Anne had witnessed it without knowing. until now. Anne's reaction: betrayal and grief. Alone once again, Anne stood in the center of the room, arms wrapped tightly around her chest. The grief wasn't just about what she'd read. It was about the years of trust she had given to people she thought understood loyalty. People she thought loved Charles, genuinely, selflessly. She pressed a shaking hand to her face, whispering to herself, "She played him for 30 years." Anne rarely cried. She had always been known as the strong one, the no-nonsense royal, the backbone behind the scenes. But this was different. Her emotions weren't just spilling out. They were breaking through a dam that had been holding them in for years. "She acted like she cared for him," Anne muttered, barely audible. But it was all a performance. She moved across the room, picking up one of the envelopes again, clutching it to her chest. These letters weren't just cold strategy. They were personal. They twisted Charles's grief, manipulated his love, and turned him against a memory he had once cherished. For Anne, the betrayal wasn't just Camilla's. It was her own, for not seeing it, for not questioning sooner, for allowing herself to believe that time had healed all wounds when in truth, some wounds had been quietly deepened. Anne fell into a chair, breath shaky, her heart heavier than it had been in years. The silence around her felt oppressive, loaded with questions. Could she ever trust Camilla again? Would Charles even believe her if she told him the truth? Was it even her place to do so? One thing was certain: nothing could ever be the same. The letter's content: strategic manipulation. As Anne laid out the rest of the letters, a pattern emerged. Camilla's influence was not emotional, it was operational. There were suggestions on how to frame Diana's public appearances, how to speak of her in interviews, even how to reassign royal duties away from her. One letter suggested Diana be given more time for personal retreat, a code phrase that Anne now understood as sidelining. Another advised Charles to speak of his true support system when asked about stress, nudging him to publicly praise Camilla instead of his late wife. Anne stared at the phrases in disbelief. It wasn't about love, it was about control. Slowly, quietly, Camilla had painted herself as the rightful royal partner, not just in Charles's heart, but in the eyes of the institution and the press. And the worst part? It worked. Anne's eyes burned. This wasn't just interference. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Camilla had rewritten a narrative, one careful sentence at a time. And now, with the letters spread before her like puzzle pieces, Anne could finally see the full picture. She didn't know what her next move would be, but she knew this: silence was no longer an option. Anne's conflict: princess versus protector. The weight of royal duty had never felt heavier. Princess Anne stood by the fireplace, the soft crackle behind her doing little to calm the storm inside. The letters were now sealed in a leather folder on the desk. She had reread them, relived every line, and now the question echoed louder than ever. What next? Was she a princess or a protector? Anne had always been fiercely loyal to the crown. From her earliest days, she'd stood as the family's silent strength, calm, dependable, and devoted to tradition. But today, that same tradition was tangled with betrayal. What Camilla had done, quietly and over decades, wasn't just political. It was personal. It had reshaped her brother's emotional history. It had buried part of Diana's legacy. And yet, exposing it could rip the family apart. She paced the floor, whispering thoughts aloud just to make sense of them. If I speak out, I betray him. If I stay silent, I betray her." Her voice trembled. The tears had dried, but the ache lingered like a bruise under the skin. There was no easy path, no clean resolution. For the first time, she questioned everything she stood for. Royal discretion had been her armor for so long. But this felt like complicity. The idea of shielding Camilla, even indirectly, twisted her stomach. She recalled her mother's words. Queen Elizabeth had once told her, "There is no strength without sacrifice, but don't ever mistake silence for grace." That line echoed now, cutting through her confusion like a blade. Anne sat down slowly, folding her hands over her lap. She wasn't just deciding for herself. She was deciding for the monarchy, for Diana's memory, for Charles, who might still be under a spell he didn't even recognize. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like, but one thing was clear. The line between silence and betrayal had never been thinner, and Anne wasn't going to be silent anymore. Courtier panic, palace alarm. Word spreads fast behind royal walls. That evening, as Anne locked the leather folder inside a secure drawer, subtle panic had already begun to ripple through the palace. A late-night noise from her private wing, footsteps, the rustle of documents, the faint click of a drawer being shut, was enough to set off a whisper storm among courtiers. The palace staff, finely tuned to every vibration in the monarchy's rhythm, knew something was off. Aides began exchanging messages. Bodyguards checked corridors twice. One housekeeper reported seeing Anne with red-rimmed eyes. Another claimed she'd seen the princess pacing with clenched fists. Inside the palace command center, a quiet alarm went off. Not from an intruder, but from sudden irregular movement in Anne's private area. Security protocols required investigation, and within minutes, 2 royal aides were discreetly summoned. Their instructions were vague. Just check in, no questions. But everyone could feel the tension in the air. By sunrise, the whisper network was alive. "She found something. It's about Camilla. Letters, hidden ones." Courtiers with ties to both Charles and Anne began choosing sides. Some advised patience. Let the king handle it. Others feared Anne might go public. And worst of all, for the palace, they knew that if Anne had evidence and a cause, she wouldn't back down. She wasn't like the others. She didn't need fame. She didn't crave power. She only cared about truth. The whispers reached the queen consort's wing. Aide after aide exchanged worried glances. One muttered under breath, "If Anne goes to the press, it's over." And just like that, the palace entered silent crisis mode. Charles summoned. Crisis unfolds. By morning, Anne had made her choice. She called for her brother. King Charles arrived at her private quarters just before breakfast. He walked in expecting a conversation, maybe even a routine catch-up. Instead, he found her standing by the window, a folder in hand, face unreadable. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with caution. She didn't answer with words. She handed him the folder. He opened it. 1 page in, his brow furrowed. 5 pages in, he sank into the nearest chair. 10 pages in, the silence in the room felt unbearable. Then came the words Anne had dreaded. Hearing, "Camilla," she urged this. There was no rage in his voice, only disbelief. A slow unraveling of trust. Anne sat beside him. She shaped the narrative, not with truth, but with tactics. Charles's face was pale, I thought she was trying to protect me, guide me." "She was guiding you," Anne said, steady now, but not toward healing, toward control. He looked up at her, eyes misting. "Do you think it was all a lie?" Anne hesitated. "No, I think she loves you, but I also think she loves power. And now you have to decide what you love more, her loyalty or Diana's truth." The room fell into heavy stillness. That breakfast was never served. Public fallout. The Queen Consort's image. It only took hours before the story leaked. Someone inside the palace, maybe a courtier, maybe a disillusioned aide, tipped off the press. At first, it was whispers. Then, it was headlines. Letters reveal Camilla's role in royal strategy against Diana. Anne breaks silence, family rift grows. Public reaction was immediate and explosive. For years, many had accepted Camilla's place beside Charles. The controversy had faded, softened by time. But now, it was reignited like dry kindling. News stations rolled 24/7 coverage. Experts debated the moral weight of Camilla's letters. Social media erupted. Team Anne trended within minutes. Sympathy flooded in for Anne, while Camilla's name was dragged back into the same storm she had once narrowly escaped. Inside the palace, royal aides scrambled. Statements were drafted, then shredded. Charles remained silent, visibly shaken. Camilla's team tried to manage the damage, but the story had escaped their grip. The Queen Consort had always walked a thin line between legitimacy and legacy. Now that line was crumbling, and for the first time in years, her position didn't feel untouchable. Confrontation. Princess versus Queen Consort. The moment finally came. Princess Anne walked into a quiet sitting room at Windsor, where Camilla waited alone. No staff, no aides, just the two women who now stood on opposite sides of one of the royal family's deepest divides. Camilla turned, eyes guarded. "Anne," she said softly, "I suppose you've read them." Anne nodded, her expression unreadable. But there was no more time for pleasantries. She reached into her coat and laid the letters on the table between them. "You shaped a version of Charles that fit you," Anne said calmly. "But in doing that, you erased pieces of Diana." Camilla's mouth parted, but no words came at first. Then she finally spoke, quietly but defensively. "I didn't erase her. I helped him survive her memory." Anne's stare was cold. "You isolated her. You influenced his decisions. You guided him when he was vulnerable." There was a pause, the kind that fills a room like thunder before a storm. Camilla's voice broke. "I loved him. I still do. And I did what I thought was right for him. And for the crown." Anne leaned in. "That may be true. But what's right for one heart isn't always right for history. And what you did, it wasn't just influence. It was control." Silence fell. Then, for the first time in the entire exchange, Camilla cried. It wasn't performance. It wasn't power. It was the release of years of secrets finally unearthed. But Anne didn't waver. She stood tall, resolute. "I'm not here to destroy you," she said quietly, "but I won't protect this either." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the letters and a legacy on the table behind her. The aftermath. all eyes on Anne. The confrontation didn't stay behind closed doors. Within 24 hours, reports surfaced that Princess Anne had met privately with Camilla. The press had no details, but the tension in the royal air was thick enough to slice. Anne, ever the quiet figure, emerged from the shadows into the spotlight, but on her terms. She didn't hold a press conference, she didn't issue a royal decree. Instead, she stepped outside Windsor Castle, stood before a sea of flashing cameras, and spoke just 12 words. "I spoke not as princess, but as protector of the legacy we lost." The media erupted. Headlines praised her bravery. Public opinion surged in her favor. Anne, once seen as the stoic royal with little flair for drama, was now hailed as the truth-bearer. People called her the new pillar of the monarchy, a voice of reason in a time of chaos. And yet, in the palace, things were far from settled. Charles looked more tired than ever in his next public appearance. His smile was strained. His hand trembled slightly as he waved. Camilla appeared only once that week, her eyes shielded behind dark glasses, her silence louder than words. But Anne stood tall. She visited charities, shook hands with the public, and continued her quiet service. But something had shifted. She was no longer just fulfilling her royal duties. She was leading them. Cliffhanger, the royal realignment. And now, the world waits. Will Camilla be quietly removed from royal duties? There are whispers of reduced public appearances, a possible health sabbatical, and even a shift in title usage behind the scenes. No official statement has been made, but silence in royal circles often says the most. Charles has reportedly called multiple private meetings with advisors. Sources say he's torn between loyalty to Camilla and the truth Anne placed before him. One insider claimed he's even considered a formal review of past decisions surrounding Diana's public role, a move that could reshape royal history. But perhaps most telling is Prince William's response. He hasn't said a word. But when asked during a school visit about Princess Anne's recent statement, he paused, placed a hand on his heart, and said, "She's always been a guide. A guide, a protector, a challenger of silence." Meanwhile, Harry, still in California, posted a single quote to social media. "Some truths are too heavy to stay buried." The message was clear. The brothers, divided by geography, seem aligned in memory. As public support grows for Anne's bold stand, the monarchy itself begins to feel the pressure. Traditions are not just being questioned, they're being tested. One thing is certain, history will remember this moment. Because betrayals can change families. But when a royal steps out of the shadow and dares to speak truth, that can change nations. And as Anne looks back at the letters that started it all, one final thought remains. Some betrayals don't just change people. They rewrite legacies. The silence is over. Princess Anne has stepped out of the shadows, not to claim power, but to protect truth. What happens next could change everything. Will this be the start of a royal reckoning? Or the final test of loyalty within the monarchy? Stay tuned, because history isn't done yet.